welcome back to my channel, The Grim Reader. I come to you today with my eclectic TBR or pile of possibilities for Victober. And the problem I'm having with it is that I had great plans for my ideas, which are falling by the wayside a little bit because of time and busyness. But I still have a TBR, I just don't have a pristine, beautiful lecture to tell you. It's going to be more casual than because there's just too much. As always, there's just too much. Anyway, let's get started with the TBR, which it's not all eclectic, but some of it is, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. First off, we have the last chronic of Barset by Anthony Trollope, which I have already started, and it's just goes straight into the comings and goings of people and families that we have heard of before and are somewhat familiar with. And so off to a great start. And what I really like about the Oxford editions, besides the fact that they're pretty, is that they have good notes. I really approve of their notes. They're not too, for me, they're not like, okay, I knew that, or this isn't that interesting. They're more like, okay, I really need to know that. That's quite useful for me. So a good level of note taking, and I do hope at some point to have time to dip into the introductions of all of them. A video I will make very soon is a preliminary ranking of the first 5 novels before 6, and then at the very end later on next year, whenever, I'll have an ultimate ranking. So that might be fun for people who are interested in Trollope. Let's see. So the first one I kind of came across because it was a bit of a surprise to me that this is a Victorian novel. And I think that one of the organizers of the whole thing is reading it too. Marissa, I think. And that is 3 Men in a Boat. So I went ahead and bought a copy of 3 Men in a Boat, which I've never read, and which, to be honest, I was convinced took place in the 20s. You know, boaters and kind of like the time of Brideshead. But no, it was published in the 1880s, and I found out that it was kind of a retelling of his own honeymoon, but he took the wife out and put men in and made it more, comic adventure type thing. And it's an early sort of very popular bestseller type book. And what's interesting about Jerome K. Jerome is that he was not upper class at all. He was, he worked himself up to, middle class, I guess. So it's sort of like a interesting thing in terms of status. So I guess I'm trying to remember exactly what year it was published, but it's definitely Victorian. Victorian goes until 1901, but just barely, because I think it's January 1901 when she passes away. Yeah. Okay, so that's something I'm looking forward to. Fun, not dark, whatever. Fun read. Have you read it? I haven't. Then I decided to pick up, because I'm a bit of a spending spree here, my birthday month, etc., this nice, pretty copy of Charlotte Bronte's Letters. Now, when we read letters, we kind of get an interesting sense of the person. It's different from reading diaries, and it's definitely different from reading their novels. And I just sort of dipped in. This is one I'll probably just kind of dip in now and then. And she's writing to her close friend Ellen Nussey, and how it's sort of sweet. She imagines what Ellen looks like after a long day at work, and how her expression, serene and kind, would calm her down. So we do see a little bit of glimpses of Charlotte's writing here too, I think. And it's a good way to sort of get a sense of her as a real living being. It's too bad that they all died so young, but that's what happened back in the day sometimes. Now, this is the first one that's kind of veering into the eclectic side of things, but definitely is still a Victorian author. And let me show you the book. Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. Now, I just completely was off with his biography. I didn't realize that he was British-Polish. I knew he was Polish, but I had assumed he was American, but I apologize for my error. I'm embarrassed that I didn't know that he was British. He became a British citizen at some point, and trying to check the year for this just to make sure it's actually still Victorian. He wrote it apparently, or maybe it was published in October of 1900, a little after Heart of Darkness. I was originally thinking of rereading Heart of Darkness, But I decided to go with Lord Jim just because I haven't read it and it sounds interesting and maybe not quite as dark. And one thing about Conrad that's amazing is how much he traveled. He was, a sailor, or he was on ships a lot. And if you look at all the places he went, so that makes him sort of different from other people. Although, Trollope was well traveled, Dickens was well traveled. Trollope wrote two books about Australia and New Zealand. And his mother, of course, hung out in Cincinnati, right around the corner. So, Fanny Trollope, I think. Anyway, so I think this will be good. Tell me what your experiences are with Joseph Conrad. I'm looking forward to it. I love the cover. I love the picture of Lord Jim. I'll be Lady Cathy, or I don't know. And so now we get into the eclectic stuff. So I decided, what the heck, I'm going to pretend or reimagine Victorian as also including Australia and New Zealand, because at least for Australia until 1900 it was part of the British Empire, and I guess that means that the people in Australia were British subjects. So I know this is the eclectic thing, and I have been it's swirling around my head, all these dates to do with Australian history. Of course, there's the jutting together of the Indigenous history, which is amazing and fascinating, and I do want to find out more about, with the colonials, the arrival of the Europeans mainly in the 1800s, 1770s, Cook, and then 1788 is the first fleet, as we would learn in primary school back in the day. Arthur Phillips brings his ships, I think it was 11, containing all kinds of people, but the weird thing about Australia is it started out as a penal colony. I mean, much more so than America. America also had some, but it didn't really work there, and it didn't really work the way they intended in Australia either. And it was phasing out in the 1850s because, it's had kind of served their purpose. Either they were sort of becoming integrated into society and building houses and squatting on the land and farming it, or they became criminal elements. And growing up in Australia, and I'm curious as to how widely known the most famous outlaw that little Australians find out about is Ned Kelly. And I still have the image of him in his weird armor with the eye. It's kind of a circular thing. I'll see if I can find a picture. And everyone knows about Ned Kelly, and he was sort of like an outlaw. So we knew that he had a gang, and he fought the police, and he has this oversized influence on certain aspects of Australian history. And there's, of course, lots of books about Ned Kelly, and I think maybe he left his own diaries, I don't know. He's sort of like, Jesse James, famous Bonnie and Clyde, but not really, because it's earlier. So you do get this sort of, the idealized, and then, I mean, in a certain sense, what's weird about Australia in terms of its writing is that the way it kind of develops its own identity as a country is it has a group of people sort of idealizing the outback and the country, the desert, the places that are uninhabitable by most people. So you have a kind of, where in Australia people live on the coasts mainly. There's very little going on in the middle. I mean, there's some cities, but it's big and empty basically, and yet the outback looms large in the Australian identity. I love a sunburnt country. I don't know, even though the last suburb we lived in was pretty unbuilt up, as we say, and there was bush there, right? We would walk a lot and on our own, and we would find caves and sit in them when it rained. It was actually pretty cool, and a lot of it was sort of built up. We lived if anyone is familiar with the Sydney area, the last place we lived before we moved to Germany was Hornsby Heights. And I've looked on Google, the house we lived in, which we had built on stilts, was kind of a mess. I mean, it's a cute little house, but tiny little house on stilts. It looks very different now because it's all built up, much more built up, and I can't recognize the house, which would cost me now apparently $1 million Australian dollars. I don't know. I can't believe it. It's a small little house. Maybe I got that wrong, but anyway, point being, I grew up there. So my sort of entree into all of this is my own background with being an Australian, if not by citizenship, by birth. So I've looked around for Australian and people who wrote novels in the Victorian era, and I couldn't come up with that many. There's some, but the ones I came across that I thought would be interesting. So the first one, and they're pretty well known from an Australian perspective, is this very interesting lady, Miles Franklin, a lady. Her actual name is Stella Maria Sarah Miles Franklin, born in October 14, 1879. So this is also kind of almost at the end of Victorian era, published I think in 1899 or 1900. And what's fascinating about this book is that she was 16 when she wrote it. And it's autofiction, so it is her life, but sort of fictionalized, her life on these farms with her father. I've just started it, and it has a really sweet, funny, but very elegant style for someone who's 16, and sort of a rhythm to it. And I have a feeling I'll really enjoy this. I've never read it before. So My Brilliant Career by, and it's a little bit sad that this is her most famous book and she dashed it off when she was 16. She did have a very interesting life that I might come back and tell you more about when I get into it more. And so, yeah, and I think it was made into a movie. And there is a follow-up. So yeah, that's the first Australian Victorian novel I'm going to read. I mean, I'm calling it Victorian. The next one is really kind of, I remember watching a TV show on. So this is a children's classic, and I think it will be fun. Published 1894, so towards the end, 1890s. Seven Little Australians. Does anyone, do any of you remember, if you were Australian, that there was a TV show that we absolutely loved, a series of this? Because it was just so much fun. It was sort of like Sound of Music, but Australian style, because it's a bunch of kids and their parents, and they all get into these adventures, and each of the kids are kind of characterized. It is Australia in the 1890s, and the 7 Woolcott children live with their widowed father and his new young wife in a large rambling house in Sydney. Life for the Woolcotts is full of drama and daredevil schemes, etc. So this is a classic in Australia's children's literature from the Victorian era. I think it'll be fun, and I will read it and tell you about it. Now, the last book really isn't, and I apologize, I'm not even paying attention to the prompts at all. I just want to do my own thing, kind of, when it comes to Victober. This is not a Victorian novel at all. It's from the 1960s, but it is probably one of the most famous Australian works of literature. And there was a fantastic movie made about it, and there's actually a newer series made about it, but it is Picnic at Canning Rock by Joan Lindsay, and I have never read it. And it even has a picture from the movie on it, Peter Weir's movie from 1975. A beguiling landscape of Australian literature, it stands with Shirley Jackson's We Have Always Lived in the Castle, Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, and Geoffrey Eugenides' Divergent Suicides as a masterpiece of intrigue. I think this will be great. And for people who are wondering, I checked, and it's completely fictional. It's not based on people's actual, it's her construction. But she did such a great job that people kind of, even I had to check, like, did these ladies really disappear? And, it's not to say that strange mystical things don't happen in the world, but this one apparently didn't really happen. She made it all up. And and she did a good job. Apparently she was quite old when she wrote this. I think I found out that she was like 70 when she wrote this. So of course they said to Bill, there's still hope for me, but I'm not going to be writing anything. I highly doubt it. Very interesting. Born in Melbourne in 1896, so she was born during the Victorian era. But then she published this in 1966. So yeah, she was 70 about. Amazing. I will read this. Have you read it? Have you seen the movie? What do you think? So, and I have actually 2 other books, and we're only at 14 minutes, so let me get them. This might turn into its own video because this is the New Zealand part of the eclectic Victorians. I have 2 books here that I will get to at some point. Samuel Butler. Now I'll do a little bit more, I'll give you more biographical details about him, but he's a British writer, and this is a utopian novel, Erewhon, which is sort of nowhere backwards, but he's transposed a few letters. And basically it's connected to his time spent in New Zealand. Butler's own experiences in New Zealand, where as a young man he worked as a sheep farm on Mesopotamia Station for about 4 years. So he's based his utopian novel on New Zealand. And it's sort of like, I think it's sort of science fiction-y because it's a utopia, and it says here the novel is one of the first to explore ideas of artificial intelligence as influenced by Darwin's recently published On the Origins of the Species. Interesting. So I thought this would be fun, and I did know about this. My mother was interested in this because she's the writer, and I didn't have a copy. And this is a weird reprint of a older. It says it's annotated, but it's not annotated at all. It's just the book, but that's fine. I was going to say something about Darwin's, who he went to Australia, right? And he wrote stuff about Australia. I thought that might be more fun for me to read than The Origin of Species, which, to be honest, I don't think I'd have enough energy to read through it. I'm not quite sure how interested. Maybe it's great reading, I don't know, but it's definitely Victorian. The final book is coming back to my own family. He's a Victorian man, and he was my, let me get it right, great grandfather. Frederick E. Manning, this is also just a reprint that you get, was my third great grandfather, an Irish. Although, was he born in Ireland? I think he came over with his father. They were all born in Ireland. They moved to Tasmania first, but then he comes over to New Zealand and starts cohabitating and interacting and marrying a Maori. So he's a Pakeha Maori, a white Maori, as they call them. And he was not the only one. There were people who did this. And this whole book is, which I haven't read yet. I've had it on my shelf for a while, but I have never really read. It's just a reprint, so the font's kind of pale, but I do want to get into it and just read about his experiences, somewhat dated for sure, but also kind of, it's reading about my third great grandfather and how he did marry a Maori, Moengarua, my third great grandmother, and there's all kinds of stuff about him on the internet. He's a character. He's quite famous in New Zealand history as a Pakeha Maori. And it's a Victorian account of living among the indigenous folk of New Zealand, which, as you know, were very, very different from the indigenous peoples of Australia, which is another reason why the Aborigines, it's just so fascinating how they're not Polynesian. They're their own thing, and then you could read about that. Anyway, yeah, that's my eclectic collection of books here. Tell me what you think. It will take me beyond a month to read these. It's another project, and I'm still working on some other things too, but that's okay. I'm kind of in this, I'm okay with reading a lot of things slowly type mindset. Yeah, let me know what you think, and I will be reporting back at some point. I'll give you an update. We'll see how things go. And thank you all for watching and subscribing. Bye-bye.